Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your guest host, Aaron Brown, sitting in today for Michael McKay. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today is freedom under the law, or why democracy does not work and how freedom and prosperity flourish without the violence of government. I first want to welcome our very special guest, Dr. David Gordon. Hello, Dr. Gordon.
Oh, hello, Aaron. How are you?
I'm excellent. Glad to be with you. Dr. Gordon is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He earned his PhD in intellectual history at UCLA. He is the editor of the Mises Review, a contributor to several economics and philosophy journals, including the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, and has authored several great books, including Resurrecting Marx and The Philosophical Origins of Austrian Economics. There's a paper written by the famous Austrian economist and Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek called The Decline of the Rule of Law, and in it Hayek talks about how political wisdom is handed down from generation to generation. And a great point he made was that oftentimes a wonderful idea is embodied in a simple phrase like rule of law. We hear rule of law, everyone's familiar with the term. But over the years, the origins and the ideas behind the idea are lost. So the goal of this interview is to apply this idea to the term rule of law that we hear so often and show our listeners where that idea actually came from, the source of this idea of freedom under law or rule of law, and why real rule of law should matter to them. This is a very important show, and this is one I hope our listeners go back to listen to several times over, since not many understand the knowledge contained in this interview. So Dr. Gordon, Hayek wrote in this article that the phrase rule of law came from a Greek word called isonomia. And for those of you listening, that is spelled isonomia. So I'm just going to let you go at it. David, can you tell us the story of isonomia? What does isonomia mean, and where did it come from?
Yes. Well, I should say I'm glad that you start off with mentioning Friedrich Hayek, because he was one of my teachers. I was in his class for philosophy of social science, and he was visiting at UCLA in 1969. I took that class. He was an easy grader. But what Hayek meant, isonomia, is sort of the notion of first you have to get the Greek word nomos, meaning law, and this is isonomia, meaning sort of self-rule or self-law. So it would be the notion of giving the law to yourself. And what Hayek had principally in mind, something like this: suppose you're planning your action, like you're going to do various things during the day, you have your regular activities. It's very important for you to know that force won't be used against you unless you do certain things. Say, unless you start beating up people or robbing them, the government isn't going to use force against you. So Hayek thought it was very important that we, in planning our activities, that we have we know in advance when force might be used. We'll have there are fixed rules that tell us unless you do such and such, force won't be used against you. And by having fixed rules, this will enable us to plan our activities. Now, Hayek extended that, and he thought that all government regulations, all laws, should be of this general character. There shouldn't be laws singling out particular people or particular groups of people. That all the laws would have this very general character, so then people would be able to plan their activities and rational action could take place. So that's basically what he meant by rule of law.
Okay, I see. And we're coming close to the end of this first segment. We will be back with Dr. David Gordon. We are talking about freedom under the law. We will be back on Radio Free Market. Stay with us. Welcome back to RadioFreeMarket.com. We are talking to David Gordon about freedom under the law. So, David, we just discussed where isonomia came from, and it means, the etymology of the word means self-rule. So I wanted to ask you, David, we're all taught in America that America is a democracy and that democracy is the greatest of all political systems. Was America founded as a democracy?
No, it actually wasn't. If you look at the founding fathers, they were very critical of democracy. They thought of democracy as something like mob rule. And I think we can see what they had in mind when we say, well, of course, everybody believes in democracy, because what would be the alternative? Wouldn't be some kind of dictatorship. But you see, this is really a false antithesis. It's not a correct. Those are sort of like asking you to choose between two bads. Now, democracy is a system in which the majority decides what the law will be or what the government should do, either directly or by representative. But this is not necessarily in accord with the rule of law in the way we just explained it, because I suppose you can have in a democracy, you could have all sorts of arbitrary acts. You could say have laws suppressing minorities as long as the majority voted for them. So the idea of a rule of law, by contrast, is that each person has a sphere of rights that tell him what he can do, and that the government would not interfere with him unless he uses force to violate other people's rights. So see, even if the majority of people wanted to interfere with people, that would be inconsistent with the rule of law. So the rule of law and democracy are two very different things, and the founding fathers were very clear that they wanted government, laws that this is the whole point of the Bill of Rights, that there are restrictions on what Congress can do. That it isn't, we say the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That means that Congress can't make such a law. It's not, even if the majority in Congress, the majority of people want such a law, they can't do it. So that's not strict. We don't have a strict democracy in this country, and we weren't intended to.
Mm-hmm. And on that point, the founders, David just said, the founders of America were well aware of what democracy really meant, and that's why they were critical of it. And I found a couple quotes from the founders. This one from Thomas Jefferson, and it's very illuminating. Listen to what Jefferson says about democracy, just to David's point. He said, quote, "A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. And John Adams said this about democracy. He said, "Democracy, while it lasts, is more bloody than either aristocracy or monarchy. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide." I mean, that's a pretty intense quote. So, David, if the American people knew and understood these kinds of quotes from the founders, do you think there would be a different attitude towards the very idea of democracy?
Yes, I think because it's just a term that's come into common use, and people just say, especially during World War II and World War I, they would contrast the democracies with dictatorships. They say, well, we're fighting the Nazi dictatorship and we're a democracy, but that wasn't the actual way the founding fathers intended things. I was very interested in your quotation, especially from Jefferson, that was so much in agreement with what I was saying. Jefferson must have been listening into our broadcast.
That's of course who he credits the future David Gordon for his ideological tenet.
Yes, why not backwards causation?
So in prepping for this show, Michael McKay, he suggests I explore the idea that instead of rule of law, today in America we have kind of rule by our temporary ruler of the day, whoever the masses vote in. How does democracy lead to this type of situation?
Well, I think Michael makes a very good point there, because in a democracy, it's whatever law, whatever rule gets the approval of the majority will be the law, and that can change. Say you can always have shifting majorities. Say we see, for example, today Obama was elected by a substantial number of people, but now it appears a lot of people are very critical of him. So you can have majorities can change from time to time, but the notion of a rule of law, the law really remains stable. That doesn't mean there can never be any new laws, but if you have a rule of law, there have to be stable general regulations in place so people can plan their activities, so you don't have this kind of shift that you do in democracy, in a pure democracy where it's just dependent on the popular will and emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't even write this down, but I was just thinking, it's very inconsistent, the government in general, because we're talking about isonomia, kind of this consistent general body of rules. But then in our present system, the masses will, or the 51%, the majority will vote in a certain type of legislation. But then even if the other 49%, the next time they get into office, they never repeal the last thing that the opposition, the majority of the last regime, they'll never repeal those legislation. They're just impose their own. So all of a sudden we have this huge, massive body of legislation, but no regime ever really repeals the legislation of the last.
Yes, that is an interesting point. You find in general a trend toward an increase in government control of our lives and government control of the economy. Even when you find people, say as Reagan did, say, well, we want to cut back on government, it doesn't really do that. It's maybe the increase isn't as much as it would have been with some others, but it's still an increase. So we do have a general trend toward more government control, whereas the notion of rule of law is, aside from these fixed general regulations, people should be free to conduct their activities as they want. And the way Hayek took it was that freedom consists of having this, or knowing that we're just limited by these general regulations. There are various objections that one could make to that, but I think he has there's certainly a great deal in what he says that we want there to be some very stable set of regulations rather than be subject to the arbitrary will of other people, even if this arbitrary will is supported by a temporary majority.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked for now about 9 minutes about democracy. Why does this matter? Why should our listeners care? Democracy seems to be working, just fine, fine and dandy. Why should our listeners even care? Why should they be concerned that America has become a democracy?
Well, I think the thing to understand is that democracy isn't working that well. As we see, the economy has rather collapsed. We're involved in wars in Afghanistan. We're still elsewhere. We're sort of in a very bad state of affairs just because we're subject to arbitrary rule. If we had a free market economy under the rule of law, then we wouldn't be in the financial and economic mess we are now. We wouldn't have had such a collapse as we did in 2008. We wouldn't be involved in all sorts of foreign wars that whether they have any relation to American national interest or not. So democracy doesn't work very well. One thing, particularly in foreign policy, there's a very influential theory now that says democracies don't go to war with each other. So this notion is just a recipe for more wars, because the consequence people draw from that theory is we have to replace all sorts of non-democratic regimes with democracies, and this is just recipe for perpetual war.
Yeah, it seems as if if the American government takes upon itself the right to go anywhere and spread democracy, that we shouldn't really be surprised when if we go into Iran or if we go into this or that place. But that's beside the point. For our listeners who are still in there, we have about a minute and a half left, so you'll have about a minute to respond to this. For our listeners who are in their intellectual discovery or still don't really realize how dangerous democracy is, I'd just like to have you comment on this quote, since you're the Marx expert. And this is what Marx said about democracy. Marx said, "Democracy is the road to socialism." And this should be shocking to everyone listening. I mean, this is Karl Marx saying this. Karl Marx was of the opinion that democracy paves the way for socialism, and of course he didn't think that was such a bad thing. So just to bring up an important statistic that has been brought up in other shows, in the 20th century, socialist regimes were responsible for 94 million deaths. So for our listeners, that is why you should care that America has become a democracy. So can you comment on this quote, David? You have about 45 seconds.
Well, I think what Marx had in mind there was that if you have a democracy, that subjects property to the will of the majority, and he hoped that through what he called bourgeois democracy, this would lead to a revolution. Then you'd have proletarian democracy, where the proletariat would act as be in charge.
David, after the break, I want you to comment on that again. I'm sorry, we're coming close to the end of this segment. Please stay with us on Radio Free Market. We'll be back with Dr. David Gordon on the rule of law. Hello, America. We are back on Radio Free Market. And, David, I want to let you finish that thought on that quote from Karl Marx when he said, "Democracy is the road to socialism." So go ahead.
What Marx tended to do, he wrote in various accounts when he was dealing with certain revolutions at the time, like he wrote a pamphlet like Civil Wars in France, and he wrote on the Third Commune. In European politics, especially in France and Germany in the 19th century, there were struggles between different political groups. You had when Marx thought that these political groups represented particular class interests, and the Democratic parties usually represented what he called the bourgeoisie, where the middle class or lower middle class parties, and he supported those as against the aristocracy. He thought that by putting them in, it would be easier to make a transition to socialism. So he thought once there was a proletarian revolution of the workers, then there would be a new kind of democracy in which the proletariat would assume dictatorial powers and then suppress all the other classes. So that would be the sense in which he thought democracy was the road to socialism. I'd have to see the context of the quote to know exactly what he had in mind. That in general was his view.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So for our listeners, that's what we just heard, was that Karl Marx saw democracy in his kind of brand of supporting democratic, the kind of bourgeoisie class interest, as a way to fuel the proletariat revolution, and that they would take over, that they would foment a revolution and take over the country.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he say if you look, say in the history of 20th century politics, say the American communists would tend to support very left-wing measures that would be considered more democratic, because they thought that would be a means of helping them achieve their revolutionary goals.
Mm-hmm. So our goal today is to integrate the concept of ethics, norms of fairness and cooperation with the law. And I think most reasonable people would agree that equality under the law, or rule of law, is a must for a free and open society. It means the same rules apply to everyone. So first we have to have a few ground rules, and I just put two and only two, since I only think two rules are really needed for a free society, and that's universal respect for other people's property, and do what you say what you will do. In other words, keep your promises. So I want to read a very profound quote from Aristotle about private property rights. He said, "That which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest, and only when he is himself concerned as an individual." And he also said, "Property should be as a general rule private. For when everyone has a distinct interest, men will not complain of one another, and they will make more progress because everyone will be attending to his own business." So, David, why is private property so important to a free society?
Well, I think Aristotle has given a very good case there that when he was writing that, you see, he was criticizing Plato, who in the Republic proposed a system in which the guardian class would have all property in common, and they would also raise their children in common. And Aristotle's point is, well, we don't care very much for things that aren't directly under our control. Say, we would find, say, people will take, say, much better care of their own yard than they will of the public street because their yard belongs to them. So we can make a very good case. It's in our self-interest to have property. And then it's also important that property is an individual right, that if we acquire, say, land or other resources that no one else has used, it's within our rights to do so, and other people don't have the right to then take it away from us. So even if, say, the government said, well, look, there are all these very poor people or unfortunate people, we want to take away your money and give it to them, we think this is a good use of the money. Even if it is a good use of the money, it's up to us to decide whether we want to spend it in that way. It's our right to own our own income and property.
And on that, that's a good segue into our next point. We only have about a minute left, but I'm going to bring this up anyway and let you go as far as you can in the next minute. But I'd just like to bring out a few examples just to illustrate this point in the context of property rights, which we just talked about. This point that equality under the law is not actually present in America today. At first, I think it's necessary to simply define, for example, what a bailout actually is. I think a lot of times it's not that people don't have a common sense of decency and fairness. It's just that a lot of times they're confused. And so I want you to please just define what a bailout actually entails. And you have about 20 seconds.
Oh, well, a bailout would be saying that it's because the government thinks it's very dangerous for the economy if certain firms fail, it's going to take money away from the rest of us and give it to these failing firms. It doesn't sound like a very good idea, and it violates our rights. What if we don't want to help out these firms?
Mm-hmm. And we're to come back to that after the break. We are here on Radio Free Market with Dr. David Gordon talking about freedom under the law. Please stay with us.